Attention viewers. Before we dive into this story that will chill you to the bone, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single twist in this dark plot. He told her he had found someone else, but 3 years later, at a dazzling charity gala, the millionaire CEO froze as a little girl with his eyes hid behind her dress. Mason Thorne always believed he understood exactly what he wanted from life. Structure, discipline, success, and a partner who would fit perfectly into the image he had built for himself. For years, this illusion held firm, and he moved through each day as if following a script perfectly tailored for a millionaire CEO. However, the day he told Julia he had found someone else, there was a strange heaviness beneath the confidence in his voice, a weight he couldn't identify, as if part of him knew he was speaking a lie he would only understand much later. The office around him was impeccable and polished. The skyline gleamed behind vast glass windows, and Julia stood silently amidst all that cold perfection, a soft, warm contrast that made everything else look sharper. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight. Her blue eyes, always so bright when she laughed, were calm now, almost too still. And that unnatural stillness twisted Mason's stomach, even as he forced himself to keep his expression unreadable. He expected rage. He expected tears. He expected questions. But Julia merely inhaled deeply, as if bracing herself against a storm no one else could see. She fiddled with the sleeve of her sweater, an old habit he hadn't realized he had memorized, and for a moment, he saw the flicker of vulnerability she was trying to hide. It flickered like a candle in the wind, brief but real. Then she straightened her shoulders with quiet dignity, and the fragile moment vanished. She nodded once, that small movement carrying more acceptance and pain than any words could. This simple gesture caught him off guard in a way he didn't fully comprehend, but he refused to let it show. He told himself that leaving was best for both of them. He told himself that the woman he was now seeing fit the life he had planned, the image he needed. He told himself that Julia, with her sweetness and sincerity, would be happier away from the relentless demands of his world. But when she walked past him and reached the door, something inside him involuntarily clenched, a brief panic he stifled before he could grasp it. Julia paused for a heartbeat with her hand on the knob, as if silently taking one last breath before crossing a threshold she could never return from. She didn't look back. She simply slipped out of the office with a silent grace that felt like the closing of a chapter neither of them had been ready to end. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence in the office grew incredibly loud. Mason stood there, surrounded by everything he had worked for: success, power, order, and yet he felt strangely empty, as if something essential had been removed. He tried to shake it off, occupying himself with paperwork, messages, and upcoming deadlines. But each task only made the emptiness settle deeper. He convinced himself it was just residual guilt, something that would fade with time. But time didn't soften the strange ache. It only pushed it deeper within him, to a place he wouldn't discover until it was too late: the flight to freedom. Julia left the city before dawn, carrying nothing more than a single suitcase, her purse, and the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. The bus station smelled of coffee, cold metal, and exhaustion, and she felt strangely invisible as she bought her ticket with trembling hands. No one cared that she was leaving behind a man she had once imagined forever with. No one noticed the way she kept pressing her palm against her stomach, as if trying to quiet something fragile inside her. The bus hissed as it arrived, and when the doors opened, she stepped inside without allowing herself even a glance back, terrified that if she looked at the city she had called home, she would lose the strength to leave it. She found a seat by the window, pulled her knees up, and watched the skyscrapers slowly dissolve into the distance. The further she went, the more her chest burned with a mix of heartbreak, confusion, and something that felt very close to freedom. The new town greeted her with salty air, narrow streets, and the soft roar of waves crashing against the shore. She rented the cheapest studio she could find, peeling wallpaper, noisy neighbors, a heater that rattled at night. But it was hers, untouched by Mason's shadow. She took whatever jobs she could, clearing tables at a cafe, cleaning offices in the evenings, helping unpack stock at a small art supply shop. Each day she came home exhausted, her hands sore, her back throbbing. And yet, there was a quiet strength burgeoning inside her that she hadn't felt in years. She was surviving without him. She was rebuilding. She was learning how strong she truly was, even as the loneliness settled like dust in the corners of her days. The inevitable truth. But 2 weeks after settling in, everything changed again. She had been washing her face late one evening when she saw herself in the mirror, paler than usual, tired, but somehow different. Her breath hitched. She counted the days, and then she counted them again. The realization hit her so hard, she had to grab the sink to steady herself. The next morning, she bought a test at a small corner pharmacy, and her fingers trembled as she carried the small box back to her studio. She sat on her bed for a long time before opening it, as if delaying the inevitable truth. When the result appeared, her heart thumped in her chest in a way she had never experienced. She was pregnant. The room seemed to tilt slightly as she stared at the result, the truth resounding loudly in her ears. She cried, silently at first, then uncontrollably, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle the sobs. Not because she regretted the life growing inside her, but because she suddenly felt the weight of every fear, every unknown, every long road ahead. She thought of Mason, of the way he had stood in his office, with that cold finality in his eyes. She thought of the woman he had chosen instead. She thought of the life she had once imagined with him, and how violently it had shattered. For one fleeting moment she imagined calling him, telling him the truth, hearing him say something, anything that would help her breathe again. But then she remembered his voice, the certainty in the words, "I've found someone else." And she knew he had made his choice long before she even knew she was carrying his child. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, she wiped her cheeks and placed a gentle hand over her stomach. In that moment, something shifted within her. The tears dried, replaced by a fierce, protective warmth she hadn't expected. This child was not a mistake. This child was not a burden. This child was hers. And she would fight for this tiny heartbeat with everything she had. She whispered softly in the quiet room, promising the little life inside her that she would be enough, that they would build a future together, whether anyone else stood by her side or not. It was the beginning of a different kind of strength, one she had never needed before, but which she would now depend on for every day to come. Audience Interaction, Part 1. Julia chose to leave without telling Mason. If you were in her place, carrying a secret that big, would you have told him before you left the city? Or do you agree with her choice to protect herself first? Let us know your immediate thoughts in the comments. The coastal anchor, Julia's pregnancy unfolded as a long, uneven road. Quiet stretches of calm suddenly interrupted by moments of fear so sharp they stole her breath. The small coastal town, which at first felt like a temporary refuge, slowly transformed into a place where she could breathe, without constantly fearing running into the man who had broken her. Her days started early, often before dawn, when she would sit at the small table by her window and sip hot tea. Watching the fishermen prep their boats, listening to the gulls cry over the water. Those quiet mornings became her anchor, the only time she allowed herself to truly feel everything churning inside her. She pressed her palms against her growing belly and envisioned the tiny heartbeat within, trying to imagine the face of the child she would soon meet. Work became harder as her stomach grew. Carrying trays at the cafe left her breathless. Bending to pick up supplies at the art shop sent sharp aches through her back, and her cleaning shifts became nearly impossible. Yet, she pushed through each day with stubborn determination, refusing to let fear dictate her decisions. Her co-workers noticed her slower movements, but never asked questions, and she was grateful for that quiet respect. The only person who did show concern was the elderly owner of the art shop, Mrs. Greaves, whose gentle eyes missed nothing. One afternoon, after watching Julia rub her lower back for the 10th time, she simply said, "If you ever need help, dear, you come to me." It wasn't pity. It was understanding, carved from years of her own experience. That single sentence made Julia feel seen in a way she hadn't since leaving the city. The doctor visits were modest, with outdated equipment and squeaky chairs, but the doctor himself was kind and patient. He explained each stage of the pregnancy slowly, making sure she understood everything. And when the monitor first revealed the faint outline of her baby, Julia felt her world tilt. She stared at the grainy image, barely daring to breathe, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "Hello," to the tiny person who had already become the center of her universe. She walked home afterward, the image clutched to her chest, terrified of creasing it or losing it. Every few minutes she would stop just to look at it again, smiling through fresh tears. The months passed, and her life settled into a rhythm built around preparation. She saved every extra dollar, skipping small luxuries so she could afford a used crib from a neighbor and some soft blankets from a thrift store. She taught herself to knit from an online video and made tiny hats in neutral colors, whispering to herself that the child would forgive her for the uneven stitches. At night, she would sit near the window with her hands resting on her stomach, humming softly as the baby kicked gently, as if responding to her voice. Those moments strengthened her in ways she never expected. Every kick reminded her that she wasn't alone, that she was building a future, even if the road behind her had collapsed. But there were also darker nights when the wind howled against the thin walls of her studio, and doubts crept in like a tide she couldn't hold back. She wondered if she would be enough, if she could give her child the life they deserved, if it would ever stop hurting the way Mason had dismissed her so easily. She wondered what he would say if he knew she was carrying his child. Sometimes she imagined him calling, apologizing, asking her to come back. Other times she imagined him laughing, confirming every fear she tried to bury. She fought those thoughts fiercely, refusing to let them steal the hope she was nurturing for her baby. A new beginning. When the birth came, it arrived in a way that felt incredibly sudden, yet inevitable. She woke up early one morning with a sharp pain that rippled through her body, stealing her breath. For a moment, she lay frozen in the dim light of her room, listening to the waves crash outside as the pain surged again. She reached for her bag, packed weeks before, and made her way to the small clinic, her steps slow but steady. The nurses recognized her instantly and rushed to help, guiding her to a room with warm lighting and soft voices. The hours blurred into a mix of pain, sweat, whispered breathing, and pure determination. And then, in a moment that felt suspended out of time, her daughter entered the world. The first cry was tiny but fierce, and when the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Julia felt her heart open in a way that made every hardship, every lonely night, every moment of fear dissolve into nothing. She stared at Brooke, her dark hair wet and soft, her warm brown eyes blinking with quiet curiosity, and felt the deepest certainty she had ever known. This child was her purpose, her future, her strength in human form. She kissed the tiny forehead, breathing in the newness, and whispered promises only a mother could make. In that small, quiet room, lit by the soft morning light, Julia realized she hadn't lost everything the day she left Mason. Instead, she had found the beginning of a new life, one she would learn to build, protect, and cherish with every piece of her heart. CTA, middle. The strength Julia showed is incredible. If you're moved by her journey, hit that like button now and tell us, what's the biggest challenge you've overcome to protect someone you love? Share your story in the comments. The quiet years, Brooke's first 3 years, unfolded like a long, gentle dawn. Slow, bright, and filled with moments Julia wished she could bottle forever. Motherhood reshaped her days completely, turning the small coastal town into a world of routines built around small steps, soft giggles, and endless discoveries. Her studio apartment remained cramped and worn, but it was filled with warmth. Crayons scattered across the table, tiny socks drying by the window, children's books piled on the nightstand. The walls that once echoed with silence now held Brooke's babbling, her squeals of delight when she learned to stand, her soft humming when Julia rocked her to sleep. The exhaustion was constant, but it came with a sweetness that made it feel meaningful rather than burdensome. Julia often woke before dawn, not because she had to work, but because Brooke would kick in her sleep and murmur softly, as if dreaming her way into the day. By the time Brooke turned 1, she was already showing her own personality. She was observant, with a quiet intelligence that made her pause before touching new things, as if studying them from every angle. When Julia took her to the beach on weekends, Brooke would sit in the sand for long stretches, running her small fingers through the grains, tilting her head as if absorbing some ancient wisdom hidden in the ocean breeze. Other children rushed into the water, screamed, laughed, pushed, but Brooke preferred to stay close, pressing her cheek into her mother's knee as she listened to the waves. The townspeople adored her. The regulars at the cafe where Julia sometimes worked would slip her pieces of fresh fruit or draw small doodles on napkins to make her smile. Even strangers would stop to compliment her dark hair and deep brown eyes, which glowed with a warmth that invited affection. Julia watched her daughter grow with a sense of wonder she never got used to. Every new milestone felt like a victory. They celebrated her first step with applause and laughter in the tiny living room, her first whispered word in the stillness of a late night, her first drawing made with a crayon so worn it stained her fingers. Julia took photos when she could, not of grand events, but of small moments. Brooke reaching for a flower, Brooke hugging her stuffed bunny, Brooke falling asleep with paint on her hands after a messy afternoon of creativity. These snapshots became Julia's treasures, physical proof of the life she was building. Financially, life remained tight, but it was no longer terrifying. After noticing how quickly Brooke gravitated toward the art supplies, Mrs. Greaves at the art shop began letting Julia bring her to the studio during slow hours. At first, Brooke would simply sit quietly on the floor, scribbling while her mother organized shelves or cleaned paintbrushes. But soon, the teachers noticed how still she became when watching them work, her large eyes tracking every move as they mixed colors or shaped clay. One afternoon, when a teacher offered her a small slab of clay, Brooke touched it with a seriousness far beyond her years and gently pressed her tiny hand into it. The mark remained there, a small imprint that made the adults exchange surprised glances. Julia tucked the piece of clay into her bag that night, as proud as if Brooke had won a national award. These early years also brought new friends, other mothers who lived nearby, a retired couple downstairs who loved to babysit, and even some coworkers who treated Brooke like a niece. From them, Julia learned to navigate tantrums, teething, sleepless nights, and unexpected fevers. She learned how to be strong and soft at the same time, how to protect Brooke without suffocating her, and how to accept help without being ashamed to need it. Through it all, she never regretted her decision to leave the city. She never wished she had told Mason the truth. In her mind, their chapter was closed, but there were quiet nights when memories crept in uninvited. On those nights, after Brooke had fallen asleep, Julia would find herself staring out the window, the moonlight caught in her hair, as she wondered if Mason ever thought of her. She wondered if he had married the woman he claimed to have found. She wondered if he would have loved their child, if he would have been charmed by Brooke's soft giggle, or the way she scrunched her nose in concentration. The thought always hurt, sharp and deep, but it was no longer unbearable. Time had reshaped her heartbreak into something dull, a faint ache rather than an open wound. The collision, the turning point came when Brooke was 3. By then, she was a confident, bright little girl who rarely let go of her mother's hand in public, but had begun exploring the world with more assurance at home. Her vocabulary grew, her laugh became louder, and her drawings more detailed. Julia knew they were ready for something new, something bigger. When she was offered a part-time assistant position at the art studio, stable hours, slightly better pay, and the ability to bring Brooke in when needed, she accepted without hesitation. Stepping into the studio on her first official day, with Brooke holding her hand and studying everything with wide eyes, Julia felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope for a future she hadn't planned, but one she was finally ready to embrace. She didn't know that fate was moving toward her from another direction as well. She didn't know that 3 years after she walked out of a CEO's office with dignity and a broken heart, that very CEO was about to collide with her world in a way neither of them could have predicted. For now, however, in that small coastal town full of sea air and sunshine, mother and daughter lived peacefully, unaware that their quiet life was on the brink of a storm that would change everything. For the 4th year after Julia left, Mason Thorne's life had been transformed into a polished, expensive performance, one he delivered flawlessly to the world, but never truly lived within. His days were defined by strict schedules, impeccable suits, blurring business meetings, and a carefully maintained public image. To the outside world, he seemed even more successful than before, the youngest CEO in the company's history, a man who had everything: power, wealth, and a woman on his arm who fit the role of a CEO's partner perfectly. But if anyone looked closely, they would have noticed something subtly off about the way he carried himself. His eyes, once full of fire and ambition, now held a constant flicker of restlessness, as if he were forever searching for something he couldn't name. His relationship with Caroline had settled into a predictable rhythm. She was beautiful, intelligent, and knew exactly how to behave in the circles he operated in. Her dark hair and icy blue eyes never failed to turn heads, and she navigated high society events with effortless grace. Yet their connection was hollow. He felt it when they sat across from each other at dinner, her laughter too forced, her compliments too rehearsed. She loved the lifestyle, the access, the cameras, everything that came with being attached to Mason Thorne. But she didn't love him, and deep down, he knew he didn't love her either. Their relationship was convenient, expected, visually pleasing, but emotionally barren. He would sometimes catch himself remembering the way Julia used to talk with her hands, or how she listened so intently that his heart felt strangely full afterward. Caroline didn't listen. She waited her turn to speak. Julia's smile had been soft and unreserved. Caroline's was sharp, perfected through years of posing for photos. Worse yet, Caroline sensed the undercurrent of dissatisfaction and responded with subtle pressure, suggesting commitments, hinting at shared apartments, sending pictures of rings, just for fun. Mason always diverted the conversation, telling himself he simply wasn't ready for marriage. What he wouldn't admit, even in his own mind, was that deep inside lived the memory of a woman he couldn't forget, no matter how much time passed. The charity foundation Mason sponsored annually had become one of the few events he genuinely looked forward to. It allowed him to step out of the rigid world of corporate expectations and into a space where people sought to create meaningful change. Hosting the gala each year gave him a sense of purpose, a reminder that life wasn't solely about numbers and profit. And yet, even these events had begun to feel dull lately, drained of authenticity by social climbers and investors more interested in selfies than in charity. Caroline adored the galas because they offered a perfect stage, but Mason increasingly felt like he was watching his own life from a distance. In the weeks leading up to the upcoming gala, he found himself distracted in meetings, forgetting appointments, losing focus during presentations. His assistant even asked if he was unwell, but the truth was more complicated. He was haunted by a strange emptiness that clung to him like mist. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the moment Julia walked out of his office. How quiet she looked, how heavy the silence felt after she closed the door. He didn't understand why that memory resurfaced so vividly after so many years, but he often found himself imagining her life now. Had she moved on? Was she married? Did she ever think of him? Did she hate him? The questions gnawed at him like tiny, invisible teeth. He never told Caroline about Julia, not because he was intentionally hiding anything, but because the topic felt too personal, too real for a relationship built on superficial compatibility. Caroline existed in the world of presentations and appearances. Julia belonged to a softer world he had touched once, but let slip away. The confrontation, the night of the gala, Mason dressed in a bespoke navy suit, fastened his cufflinks with mechanical motions, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a man who had everything, yet nothing in his expression reflected fulfillment. Caroline appeared behind him, adjusting her earrings, complimenting his appearance with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They walked into the shimmering ballroom together, a perfect couple, or so it seemed to everyone who greeted them. But as Mason moved through the crowd, something felt different this year. A strange tension pulled at him, as if life itself were holding its breath. He couldn't explain it, only feel it. A shift in the air, an invisible force pulling him toward something he couldn't yet see. He greeted guests, shook hands, smiled when expected, but a persistent, uncomfortable stillness followed him like a shadow. Caroline, too focused on photographers and acquaintances, didn't notice his distraction. Mason didn't know there was someone else in the ballroom that night, someone who would shatter the fragile equilibrium he had been maintaining for years. Someone who had carried a piece of him away the moment she walked out of his life. Someone who would cause everything he thought he knew to collapse in a single heartbeat. In just a few minutes, his perfectly structured world would tilt. His past would collide with his present, and the future he had never dared to imagine would begin to unravel right before his eyes. The ballroom glistened under gold chandeliers, every crystal catching the light like a shooting star. Music flowed through the room in soft currents, mixing with soft laughter, tinkling glasses, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Julia walked in with careful, measured breaths, holding Brooke's small hand in hers, as the girl looked with wide eyes at the dazzling surroundings. For a moment, Julia felt as if she had entered a world she no longer belonged to, a world of wealth and polished perfection, a world she once brushed the edges of, but never truly entered. Her simple ivory dress contrasted sharply with the jeweled gowns around her, but she held her head high, determined not to let insecurity unravel her. The studio where she worked had been invited to exhibit artwork created by low-income children, and Julia had helped arrange the display. She couldn't refuse the invitation, even if it terrified her. Brooke clung to her side, her dark hair neatly tied back with a small bow, her warm brown eyes scanning the crowd with curiosity. Julia knelt down and smoothed a stray lock behind the girl's ear, whispering reassurance. "Stay close to me, darling. There are a lot of people here." Brooke nodded shyly, her fingers tightening around her mother's. The girl was used to quiet spaces, beaches, parks, cozy corners of the art studio, not shimmering rooms filled with strangers. Julia kissed her forehead, then guided her toward the section where the children's artwork was being set up. She tried to focus on the task, arranging drawings and straightening name tags while talking politely to other volunteers. However, there was a strange pressure building beneath her ribs, a faint sense of being watched. She dismissed it at first, telling herself she was simply nervous. It had been years since she had stepped into an affluent elite crowd, and the sight of so many confident, polished faces stirred up memories she had fought to bury. She reminded herself that she knew no one here, that no one would recognize her, that she was safe. But the tightness in her chest remained. Across the ballroom, Mason was moving through the crowd with polite stiffness, shaking hands, conversing, smiling when necessary. Caroline hung on his arm, laughing brightly, soaking up the attention. But Mason was not fully present. Something inside him felt strangely unsettled, as if the air had shifted, and he had walked into a moment he couldn't yet see. He paused near a table, scanning the room, not knowing what he was looking for. His gaze drifted over the crowd until it landed on a familiar silhouette near the far wall. The name hit him like lightning. He blinked, sure he was imagining her, but she didn't disappear. She was standing with her back partially turned, adjusting artwork on a display board, her soft hair falling gently down her back, the gentle curve of her shoulders, the graceful way she moved, the quiet firmness of her presence. Everything about her was unmistakable. His heart dropped, then hammered with a force that left him nearly breathless. Caroline noticed his sudden stillness. "Mason, what is it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze was locked on Julia, as if she were the only real thing in the room. And then he saw the girl. A small child was standing beside her, her tiny hand gripping Julia's dress. She wore a pale bow in her dark hair, and her warm brown eyes scanned the crowd with the same cautious curiosity Julia used to have. At first, Mason felt only confusion. Then something about the girl's face shifted. Some angle of her expression caught the light just right, revealing a familiarity so sharp it cut him. The shape of her eyes, the softness of her features, the delicate curve of her nose, the way she held her mouth when she was unsure. It was like looking at a mirror of his own childhood photographs. His breath caught. His grip tightened around the glass he was holding until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced back through years of memories. Julia's sudden departure, her silence, the hollow ache that had never completely left him. He had assumed she vanished because she wanted nothing to do with him. He never imagined another possibility. He never imagined that something else, someone else, had existed in the space between them. He set down his glass, his pulse roaring loud in his ears. Without answering Caroline's questions, he started moving across the room, his steps unsteady, his heart pounding against his ribs as if trying to break free. With every step, the distance between him and Julia narrowed, but the weight of the truth grew heavier. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know what explanation he could offer. He didn't even know if she would look at him. But he knew he had to reach her. Julia felt movement behind her, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made the tiny hairs on her arms prickle. She turned halfway. Brooke pressed against her leg, and her breath stopped. Mason was only a few feet away, staring at her with a look of disbelief so raw it almost hurt to see. His face had changed. Older, sharper, more tired. But his eyes were the same dark brown she once loved enough to forgive anything. Their gazes collided, and for a moment the world around them dissolved. She froze. Her heart hammered violently, her throat tightened, and her body felt torn between the urge to run and the urge to simply collapse. Brooke sensed the tension and pressed even closer, clutching her mother's leg with both hands. Mason's gaze dropped to the child, and Julia saw the exact second that recognition hit him. His face drained of color, his jaw slacked, and pain, deep, overwhelming pain, rippled across his expression. Everything inside Julia twisted. She had prepared for the possibility of seeing him someday, but she hadn't prepared for this. For him to witness their daughter, for him to realize exactly what he had lost, for the truth to cut them both like a blade. Mason opened his mouth, closed it. Then he tried again, his voice cracking. "Julia!" She swallowed hard, forcing her breathing into something steady, reminding herself that Brooke was watching. Her daughter didn't need fear. She needed strength. Julia placed a gentle hand on Brooke's shoulder and faced him with as much composure as she could muster. In that charged moment, heavy with shock and history and unspoken truths, the entire room around them buzzed into silence, unaware that two Lise and the future of one little girl were about to collide in a way neither of them could have foreseen. And Mason, looking at the child who looked so painfully like him, felt something inside him break for the first time in years. The cost of choice. For a long moment, Mason remained speechless, as if the words had utterly abandoned him. The noise of the gala faded to a distant hum, and all he could hear was the frantic rush of his pulse in his ears as he stared intently at the little girl, clinging protectively to Julia's leg. Brooke blinked up at him with cautious curiosity, her dark brown eyes large and alert, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her mother's dress. Mason felt something inside him tear, not violently, but slowly and agonizingly, like a seam that had been strained for years, finally giving way. He had imagined Julia with someone else after she left. He had imagined her smiling at another man or building a quiet life away from him. He had never imagined this, a child who carried his features so clearly that denial was impossible. Julia shifted slightly, instinctively placing herself a little more in front of Brooke, and the protective gesture struck him with unexpected force. It reminded him that Julia had done everything alone: the pregnancy, the birth, the long nights, the first steps, the first words, the milestones he didn't even know he had missed. He swallowed hard, trying to find words that didn't feel shallow or weak. "Julia," he said again, softer this time, as if saying her name gently could undo the years between them. His voice trembled despite his efforts, and he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Wariness, strength, and something he couldn't read anymore. She straightened, lifting her chin. "Mason," she countered calmly, her tone polite yet distant, the kind of voice someone uses with a stranger they don't trust. Her gaze didn't waver, even though he saw the subtle tension in her stance. She was ready to defend herself and her daughter if necessary, and the realization made his throat ache painfully. He wished he could erase every reason she had to be so defensive of him, but regret was a useless cure for already formed wounds. He looked at Brooke again, his heart clenching. "Is she—" He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words aloud. Julia hesitated, looking down at her daughter. And in that hesitation, Mason felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on his chest. Then she nodded once, resolutely, without drama or tremor. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "She is your daughter." The words hit him harder than any accusation he had ever faced. He felt his knees weaken, and the polished, perfect world he had built around himself wobbled at the edges, threatening to collapse entirely. His vision blurred for a moment as he tried to absorb the truth. 3 years. 3 entire years of his life passed without him even knowing she existed. Every breath he took felt shallow, almost painful. He knelt down slowly, not caring that people in the room were beginning to stare, or whisper, or look confused. His expensive suit, his status, his carefully constructed image, it all meant nothing now. He knelt because it was the only way he could look his daughter in the eye without looming over her like a stranger. Brooke looked back at him cautiously, her tiny fingers tightening on Julia's dress. Mason cleared his throat gently, trying to steady his trembling voice. "Hi," he said, speaking softly, as if addressing the most delicate piece of porcelain. "My name is—" He stopped, because saying his name suddenly felt inadequate. I'm Mason." Brooke blinked at him, studying him with a seriousness rare for a child her age. She didn't step forward, but she didn't hide either. Her gaze traveled from his eyes to his hands, to his expression, as if she were trying to decide if he was safe. Then she leaned her cheek lightly against her mother's thigh, a small gesture that made Julia's heart ache and Mason's chest tighten further. She wasn't rejecting him. She was simply trying to understand him, and he didn't deserve even that much grace from her. He looked up at Julia, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't angry. It was wounded, desperate, filled with a sorrow that seemed to hollow out his words. Julia inhaled slowly, drawing courage before answering. "Why did you make your choice?" she said simply. Not with bitterness, but with truth. "You told me you found someone else. You closed the door. And I wouldn't let my daughter grow up in a place where she wasn't wanted." The memory of that moment crashed into him like a tidal wave, the cold certainty in his own voice, the way he had convinced himself he was doing the right thing, even though something in him had twisted the instant she walked away. He hadn't known what that feeling was then, but now he did. It had been loss. Foolish, avoidable loss. And now he was looking at the living proof of what his decision had cost him. He pressed a hand against his forehead, fighting the urge to break down. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Julia, I swear, I didn't know." His voice cracked, and the raw emotion in it broke something fragile in her. She had braced herself to face his anger or defensiveness, not this devastating vulnerability. Julia looked at Brooke again, smoothing her hair gently. "I wasn't going to chase after someone who had already walked away," she said with quiet firmness. "I chose to build a life for her, a safe, peaceful life." Her eyes met his again, and he saw no accusation there, only the truth of her experience. That hurt even more. "Can I?" His voice wavered. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "Can I be in her life?" The question hung between them, heavy with fear. For the first time, Mason wasn't asking as a CEO or as the self-assured man he always presented to the world. He was asking as someone who realized he had already lost too much. Julia hesitated, not out of spite, but out of caution. For Brooke, for herself, for the fragile future that might form ahead. She studied him carefully, looking for sincerity beyond the guilt. She saw desperation, yes, but she also saw remorse, humility, and a kind of tenderness she had never witnessed in him before. This wasn't an attempt to claim her. This was about the child half hidden behind her. Brooke looked up at them again, her small fingers loosening slightly, her dark eyes curious but not scared. Julia exhaled slowly. "We will talk," she said at last. "Not a promise, not a rejection, just a beginning." Mason closed his eyes, relief and heartbreak colliding inside him powerfully enough to make him sway. When he opened them again, he looked at his daughter, and for the first time in his life, his world aligned not around ambition or power, but around a small girl with warm brown eyes who had no idea how completely she had just changed him. The path to trust in the days that followed the gala, life became a careful balance of uncertainty, hope, and slow, tentative steps toward something neither Julia nor Mason had expected. The encounter had left the air between them thick with unanswered questions, delicate and emotionally heavy, but it also stirred up something new, the possibility of rewriting their story, not as lovers stumbling through heartbreak, but as two parents trying to build a bridge for a little girl who never asked for the chaos that created her. Julia found herself reliving the moment of revelation again and again, not because she wanted to reopen old wounds, but because seeing Mason's raw reaction had moved her. She had expected cold confusion or defensive anger, but what she saw instead was devastation that seemed to reach his very bones. It was the look of a man who had been confronted with the cost of his past choices and realized too late how immense that cost truly was. Brooke, young as she was, sensed something had shifted. She became more watchful, studying her mother's face when she thought Julia wasn't looking, asking fewer questions than expected for a child, meeting someone who seemed so intensely interested in her. She remained close, anchored by the familiarity of her mother's presence, but she didn't show fear. She simply absorbed the world in that quiet, thoughtful way she always had, storing pieces in her mind like puzzle fragments she would assemble when ready. Julia found solace in that, even as her own emotions twisted painfully. Mason, meanwhile, struggled to navigate a life that suddenly felt unbearably hollow, with no place for Brooke in it yet. He returned home from the gala to Caroline, demanding explanations he refused to give, and by morning their relationship had broken beyond repair. She sensed the shift instantly. A woman like her always knew when she was no longer the center of someone's attention, and she stormed out of his penthouse in a tempest of indignation and disbelief. Mason didn't stop her. For the first time, he understood the difference between losing something convenient and realizing he had lost something irreplaceable. He spent nights staring at the ceiling, sleepless and haunted by the thought of a child who had taken her first steps without him, spoken her first word without him, laughed and cried and fussed under the care of a woman he had once driven away. The guilt was suffocating, but deeper still was the yearning, a desire so fierce it left him breathless. He wanted to know her. He needed to know her, not out of obligation, but out of a burgeoning love he didn't yet understand how to hold. It took Julia 3 days to respond to his message, a sincere, trembling apology in which every sentence seemed carved from regret. She didn't reply immediately because she needed time to figure out what was best for Brooke, not what felt easiest for her own heart. When she finally agreed to meet in a quiet park overlooking the coast, she arrived early, Brooke's small hand wrapped firmly in hers. The girl wore her favorite pale sweater and clutched her stuffed bunny to her chest, looking up every now and then, as if checking if her mother was sure about this meeting. Julia knelt beside her, brushing her cheek gently, whispering that she would never let anything bad happen. Brooke nodded, trusting her completely. When Mason arrived, he looked different, less polished, less invincible, more human. The wind ruffled his dark hair, his eyes held a depth of emotion he couldn't hide, and his steps faltered slightly when he saw Brooke. He approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm her, and knelt at a respectful distance. The moment stretched quietly between them, his gaze softening as Brooke stared back at him with somber curiosity. He didn't try to touch her, didn't force a smile, or attempt to reach out. He simply spoke in a gentle, steady voice that seemed to vibrate with sincerity. "Hello, Brooke, I'm glad you came." Brooke tilted her head and considered him the way she considered seashells on the beach before deciding which ones to pick up. Julia watched the interaction with her heart in her throat, marveling at how much care Mason poured into a single greeting. Finally, Brooke took a half-step closer, not out of confidence, but out of openness, and held out her stuffed bunny for him to see. He blinked, stunned by the gesture, and nodded as if she had handed him something precious. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. Brooke retreated back to her mother, but kept her eyes on him, silently assessing. They talked then, not all three together at first, but in slow layers. Julia told him about the pregnancy, the birth, the early years, the laughter and the hardships, the nights she stayed awake, terrified of not being enough. Mason listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from grief to awe to shame, as he absorbed every detail of a life he had missed. When he finally spoke, his voice was choked with emotion. "I want to know her. I want to earn the right to be her father, not by asking for forgiveness, but by becoming someone she can rely on." It wasn't a promise tossed recklessly into the air. It was a vow rooted in humility. Over the next few weeks, their meetings continued. Sometimes Mason joined them at the park, sometimes at the art studio, sometimes for short walks along the coast, where Brooke collected tiny shells and silently slipped her hand into his when she thought he wasn't paying attention. With every small moment, Mason's presence became less strange, and Brooke began to treat him not as a stranger, but as someone familiar, someone safe enough to share pieces of her world with. As she grew comfortable, Julia began to notice something she hadn't expected. Mason wasn't pushing for romantic reconciliation. He wasn't trying to reclaim a lost relationship or sweep her back into his life. He was focused entirely on Brooke, on learning her favorite foods, her bedtime routines, the stories that calmed her fears, the games that made her laugh uncontrollably. Seeing them together softened Julia in ways she didn't anticipate, awakening feelings she had long ago buried. But she didn't act on them. Not yet. Not until trust was slowly, deliberately rebuilt, the way strong foundations always are. The day Brooke fell asleep in Mason's arms for the first time, her small head resting against his shoulder, her breathing soft and even, Julia felt something permanently shift. He looked at her with eyes that glowed, overwhelmed by the weight of being chosen, truly chosen, by a child who had every reason to doubt. Julia sat beside him, the silence flowing comfortably between them, as the wind whispered in the trees and the waves murmured against the shore. In that moment, she realized something simple and profound. She no longer saw the man who once pushed her away. She saw a father learning to love with all his heart, a man humbled by loss and transformed by the fragile hands now curled against his chest. Their future was uncertain, not yet defined by labels or commitments, but it was open in a way that held warmth instead of pain, hope instead of fear. And as Brooke slept peacefully between them, Julia felt, for the first time in years, that she was no longer on the brink of a storm. She was at the beginning of something new, slow, fragile, beautiful, and she was no longer afraid to walk into it. Final CTAs, meaningful conclusion. Mason's journey from a man blinded by ambition to a father humbled by love is a profound reminder that true success is measured by connection, not wealth. What do you think about Julia's decision to forgive the past for the sake of her daughter's future? Let us know your perspective. Is it possible to rebuild trust after a betrayal this deep? If this story of second chances and unexpected turns resonated with you, please like this video, share it, and subscribe for more compelling true life stories. Thank you for watching.